The final rays of sunset had faded behind the towering acacia trees of the Amboseli Elephant Sanctuary. In the dimly lit observation hut, Dr. James Chen set his coffee cup down and stared intently at the monitoring screen. The blinking numbers on the sensor device signaled something unusual happening in the maternity area. Nala, a 28-year-old female elephant with the distinctive large ears of African elephants, had shown signs of labor since early morning. But what worried Dr. Chen wasn't the birthing process itself. It was the data from last week's ultrasound. The blurry images had revealed something so rare he could hardly believe his eyes. Nala was carrying twins. In his 35 years studying elephants, Dr. Chen had only heard colleagues mention this phenomenon through dry scientific papers. Statistics showed only 1% of elephant births were twins, and the survival rate for both calves was even lower. In the wild, it was nearly impossible for a mother elephant to successfully raise both calves. The evolutionary pressures that shaped elephant reproduction had not prepared the species for this rare occurrence, making each twin birth a precarious gamble with survival. The sanctuary itself had been established in 1975 as a haven for elephants displaced by human encroachment and poaching. Covering 8,000 hectares of protected savanna, it housed 127 elephants ranging from orphaned calves to elderly matriarchs. Dr. Chen had been the chief research scientist here for 12 years, documenting behavior patterns that challenged conventional understanding of elephant intelligence and social structure. As the first labor contractions began, the older female elephants in the sanctuary gathered around Nala following ancient instinct. They formed a protective circle, their massive bodies shielding Nala from any potential threats. Matisa, the eldest female at 52, stood close beside Nala like a devoted grandmother. Her weathered skin bore scars from decades of survival in the wild before her rescue, and her eyes held wisdom accumulated through countless seasons of birth, death, and renewal. Dr. Chen and his research team observed from a distance through infrared binoculars. They knew any intervention could increase Nala's stress levels, potentially leading to serious complications during birth. Elephants were extremely stress-sensitive animals, and a laboring mother could react violently to human presence even from caretakers who had worked with them for years. The team had established strict protocols, observe, document, but never interfere unless absolutely necessary for survival. Sarah Williams, a graduate student from Oxford studying elephant cognition, adjusted the audio recording equipment to capture the low-frequency communications elephants used. These infrasonic calls, often below human hearing range, could travel for miles and conveyed complex emotional and social information. Tonight, these sounds would tell a story of anticipation, community support, and impending tragedy. Time passed in tense silence. The clock on the observation hut wall ticked steadily each second, carrying anticipation. Nala's 22-month pregnancy had led to this moment, and now everything depended on millions of years of evolutionary instinct. The research team maintained detailed logs, noting every behavioral change, every vocalization, every shift in the protective formation around the laboring mother. Around 11 p.m., the first groans echoed from the maternity area. These were low sounds, almost inaudible to human ears, but specialized recording equipment captured these sound waves. Dr. Chen knew Nala was communicating with her unborn calf, a miraculous phenomenon science still didn't fully understand. Research suggested these prenatal communications might help establish the crucial mother-calf bond that would determine survival in the critical hours after birth. The night air carried the sounds of other sanctuary animals responding to the event. Hippos in the distant watering hole fell silent as if respecting the gravity of new life entering the world. Even the normally vocal baboons seemed subdued, their chattering reduced to occasional soft calls. The entire ecosystem appeared to sense the significance of what was unfolding. At exactly midnight, the first calf was born. In the dim light of night observation equipment, the research team could see a small shape fall to the wet ground with the characteristic sound of new life meeting Earth. Nala's groans now carried a different tone, no longer pain, but something resembling joy relief. The first calf, later named Django, appeared healthy and nurtured by some inexplicable vigor that marked him as a survivor from his very first breath. Sarah documented Django's initial movements with scientific precision. Within 3 minutes, the calf had lifted his head. At 5 minutes, he was attempting to stand his legs trembling but determined. At 8 minutes, he achieved his first wobbly upright position. These milestones were crucial indicators of neurological development and overall health. Each successful movement reduced the probability of developmental complications that could plague him throughout his life. But the birthing process wasn't over. Dr. Chen felt anxious realizing the second labor contractions were beginning. Nala continued struggling, and the other female elephants seemed to sense something unusual. They became restless, pacing anxiously around the protective circle. Matisa made deep rumbling sounds that seemed to encourage Nala while simultaneously communicating concern to the other females. The midnight air grew cooler, carrying the scent of approaching rain from distant storm clouds. Dr. Chen checked the weather monitors, hoping poor conditions wouldn't complicate an already challenging situation. The barometric pressure drop that preceded African storms could affect animal behavior unpredictably, sometimes inducing premature labor or causing animals to seek inadequate shelter. An hour later, the second calf was born. From the very first moments, the difference was clear. This calf, significantly smaller than its sibling, lay quietly on the ground, with movements that spoke of struggle rather than vitality. The size difference was striking. While Django weighed an estimated 120 kilograms, the second calf appeared to be barely 85 kilograms, well below the normal range for healthy elephant newborns. Dr. Chen watched through binoculars with his heart feeling squeezed. He had seen this before in other species. Twin pregnancies often resulted in one dominant fetus that received better nutrition and space, leaving the second to develop under suboptimal conditions. In humans, this was called twin-to-twin transfusion syndrome. In elephants, the phenomenon was less understood, but no less devastating. The research team maintained careful documentation of every detail. The smaller calf's breathing was shallow and irregular, its muscle tone poor, its responses to stimuli delayed. These were clinical observations, but they carried the weight of impending tragedy that no amount of scientific training could make emotionally bearable. In the wild, this phenomenon wasn't uncommon. When twins occurred, there was usually one healthy offspring and one compromised one. The species had not evolved adequate maternal resources to support two calves simultaneously through the demanding early months of life. Nature's harsh mathematics meant that attempting to save both often resulted in losing both. Nala began licking the second calf clean while using her trunk to encourage it to stand. These movements were deeply instinctual, a mother trying to stimulate her offspring's nervous system to help it become alert and active. She applied the same techniques that had successfully roused Django, but the second calf's responses were minimal. Occasionally it would lift its head or move a leg, giving false hope before settling back into lethargy. Dr. Chen knew the first hours after birth were crucial for elephant calves. They needed to stand and nurse colostrum within hours to absorb necessary antibodies for their immune system. Without colostrum, a calf's immune system wouldn't develop fully, leading to very poor disease resistance. This biological window was unforgiving. Miss it, and survival became nearly impossible, regardless of other interventions. While Nala focused on the weak calf, the healthy newborn had found a teat and begun nursing. Django proved to be a strong calf with clear survival instincts. He moved confidently under his mother's belly, his small but steady legs supporting him as he navigated the complex geography of maternal care. His nursing was vigorous and efficient, each swallow of colostrum strengthening his immune system and improving his chances of long-term survival. The contrast between the two calves became more pronounced with each passing hour. Django's movements grew stronger and more coordinated, while his sibling weakened progressively. Dr. Chen found himself drawn into the ancient tragedy of survival of the fittest playing out in real time, unable to intervene without potentially disrupting natural processes that had evolved over millions of years. 2 hours passed in anxious silence. Despite Nala's best efforts, the second calf still couldn't stand. Its breathing became weaker, and Dr. Chen's years of experience allowed him to recognize the troubling signs. The calf's temperature was dropping, its reflexes becoming sluggish, its occasional cries growing fainter. The small body was entering the final stages of physiological shutdown. Sarah Williams, monitoring the audio equipment, detected changes in Nala's vocalizations that suggested growing distress. The mother's calls were becoming more urgent, more desperate. She seemed to understand that something was fundamentally wrong with her second calf, but her instincts provided no solution for this evolutionary anomaly. The final moment came in absolute silence. The calf took its last breath and lay still, its small chest no longer rising and falling with the effort of life. Dr. Chen felt deep sadness wash over him, though he had witnessed many deaths in nature. Something was particularly heartbreaking about witnessing the passing of a life only hours old, a life that had never experienced sunlight or the full embrace of its mother's protection. The death occurred at 2:17 a.m., documented precisely in the research logs. But numbers could not capture the profound shift that immediately followed. The other elephants in the protective circle seemed to sense the loss instantly. Their body language changed, becoming more alert, more solemn. Several made low vocalizations that seemed to acknowledge the death. But Nala's reaction truly surprised Dr. Chen. Instead of turning to care for her living calf as he expected, Nala began behaviors he had never witnessed in his decades of research. She wouldn't leave the deceased calf's body, continuously touching the small form with her trunk as if trying to wake it. Her touches were gentle but persistent, focusing on the areas that would normally stimulate a sleeping calf to consciousness. Nala's calls now were completely different. Not the painful groans of labor, nor the gentle calls to her healthy calf. This was a sound Dr. Chen had never heard, a desperate cry that seemed to carry the weight of incomprehension and loss. The vocalizations had a haunting quality that made Sarah Williams remove her headphones, unable to bear the raw emotion pouring through the audio equipment. The other female elephants also began reacting unusually. Instead of dispersing after the birth as usual, they maintained their protective circle. But now their formation served a different purpose. They were containing and supporting a grieving mother rather than protecting a laboring one. Matisa moved closer, placing her massive head near Nala in a gesture that transcended species in its obvious intent to comfort. Other elephants made low sounds, a form of communication that researchers were only beginning to understand. These weren't random vocalizations, but seemed to follow patterns that suggested complex emotional exchanges. Dr. Chen realized he was witnessing something that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal consciousness and emotional capacity. Dr. Chen realized he was witnessing a rare phenomenon in the animal world, the complex interaction between maternal instinct and the deep emotions of elephants. He had read studies showing elephants could feel loss, even having simple funeral rites. But witnessing this directly was an entirely different experience that would reshape his understanding of animal psychology for the remainder of his career. While Nala continued her vigil over the deceased calf, Django, the healthy newborn, moved around his mother in growing confusion and distress. He seemed unable to understand why his mother wasn't responding to his needs. His attempts to approach for nursing were continuously interrupted by Nala's absolute focus on her dead offspring. The living calf's distress calls became more frequent and urgent as hunger and confusion overwhelmed his initial vitality. As dawn broke over Amboseli, painting the savanna in golden hues that should have celebrated new life, Dr. Chen and his research team had stayed awake all night, documenting an unprecedented behavioral crisis. The situation hadn't improved at all. Nala still refused to leave the deceased calf's body, and more worryingly, she seemed completely unaware of her living offspring's desperate needs. Django hadn't nursed properly in many hours, and Dr. Chen knew this situation couldn't continue without risking the loss of both calves to this tragic turn of maternal psychology. This was the mystery no one on the research team could explain through conventional animal behavior models. Why would a mother elephant equipped by evolution with some of the strongest protective and nurturing instincts in the animal kingdom neglect a living calf to focus obsessively on a dead one? The behavior seemed to contradict every principle of evolutionary biology that prioritized the survival of viable offspring over mourning the dead. Could this be a form of postpartum depression in animals, a condition that human medicine was only beginning to understand in our own species? Or was it simply instinctual confusion caused by the extremely rare occurrence of twin birth, an event so uncommon that evolution had provided no adequate behavioral template for handling it? The questions multiplied faster than answers, each one leading to deeper mysteries about the nature of consciousness, emotion, and maternal bonds in highly intelligent animals. These questions would lead Dr. Chen on a profound journey of discovery into elephant psychology and emotions, a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between human and animal experience. As the sun climbed higher over the African landscape, illuminating a scene of beauty and tragedy intertwined, he prepared to enter uncharted territory in the understanding of animal grief and the healing power of community support among Earth's most emotionally sophisticated creatures. The morning light over Amboseli Elephant Sanctuary brought no usual warmth or promise of renewal. Instead, it served as a harsh reminder of the desperate night that had just passed, illuminating a scene that would challenge everything the research team thought they understood about animal emotion and maternal instinct. Dr. James Chin stood by the observation hut window, his eyes swollen from staying awake all night gazing toward the maternity area where an extraordinary tragedy continued to unfold with each passing hour. Nala remained exactly where she had been for the past 8 hours, her massive gray form a monument of grief beside her deceased calf's small body. Her posture had evolved from the frantic attempts at revival that characterized the early hours of loss to something more profound and mysterious, a vigil that seemed to transcend basic animal behavior and enter the realm of complex emotional processing that scientists were only beginning to recognize in elephants. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the sanctuary's chief veterinary specialist, had arrived at dawn after receiving Dr. Chen's urgent radio message. With 15 years of experience treating elephants across 3 African countries, she had witnessed virtually every form of elephant behavior imaginable. But even her extensive background had not prepared her for the scene that greeted her arrival. Standing beside Dr. Chen, she studied the tableau through high-powered binoculars, her scientific mind struggling to categorize what she was observing. The deceased calf lay where it had died, but Nala had arranged its position with careful deliberation. Using her trunk with infinite gentleness, she had positioned the small body so that it appeared to be sleeping rather than dead. The calf's head rested on a small mound of soft earth that Nala had gathered, and its legs were arranged in a natural sleeping position. This wasn't random behavior. It was a conscious attempt to create an illusion of life, or perhaps a refusal to accept the reality of death. Django, now 12 hours old and showing increasingly obvious signs of distress, wandered near his mother's legs with the desperate persistence of a starving infant. The healthy calf's instincts were functioning perfectly. He knew he needed milk, and he knew where to find it. But each attempt to nurse was met with subtle rejection as Nala shifted position to maintain her focus on the deceased sibling. She wasn't aggressively pushing Django away, but her complete absorption in grief left no emotional space for acknowledging his needs. Dr. Chen had spent the early morning hours consulting research databases and contacting colleagues around the world. The phenomenon they were witnessing had been documented only a handful of times in scientific literature and never with the detailed behavioral analysis that modern research methods allowed. Each documented case had ended differently. Some mothers eventually returned to caring for surviving offspring, while others continued mourning until the living calves died of neglect. Dr. Rodriguez began her examination of Django from a distance using binoculars to assess his physical condition without disturbing the delicate psychological situation surrounding Nala. The calf's gait had become less steady, his skin was beginning to show slight dehydration, and his vocalizations carried increasing desperation. Most critically, his attempts to nurse had become less frequent as weakness began to override hunger. The veterinary assessment was sobering. Django had perhaps 18 to 24 hours before dehydration and hunger would cause irreversible damage to his developing systems. His immune system, already compromised by inadequate colostrum intake, would begin shutting down. The irony was devastating. Nala had an abundance of milk and was physically capable of nursing, but her psychological state prevented her from recognizing her living calf's existence. At mid-morning, Dr. Michael Kariuki arrived from Nairobi, his Land Rover creating dust clouds that announced his approach long before the vehicle became visible. A Kenyan researcher with 40 years of elephant experience, Dr. Kariuki brought a perspective that bridged Western scientific methodology with traditional African knowledge systems that had observed elephant behavior for millennia. His presence represented the sanctuary's commitment to integrating indigenous wisdom with modern conservation science. After studying the situation through binoculars for 30 minutes, Dr. Kariuki shared insights that reframed everything the team thought they understood about the crisis. In Maasai and Kikuyu traditions, which had coexisted with elephants for thousands of years, there were detailed observations of elephant mourning behaviors that Western science was only beginning to document. These weren't folklore or superstition. They represented generations of careful observation by people whose survival often depended on understanding animal psychology. Traditional knowledge described elephant mothers who needed to complete their goodbye before they could emotionally return to caring for living offspring. This wasn't simply a matter of time passing, but required specific ritualistic behaviors that allowed the mother to process her loss and transition from mourning back to nurturing. The process couldn't be rushed or forced. It had to follow emotional patterns established by millions of years of elephant evolution. Dr. Kariuki's explanation provided context for Nala's seemingly irrational behavior. She wasn't simply being stubborn or emotionally unbalanced. She was following deeply embedded psychological protocols for processing loss, protocols that had evolved to help elephants maintain social cohesion and emotional stability after experiencing death. The problem was that these protocols had never evolved to account for the survival needs of twin offspring because twin births were too rare to influence evolutionary development. The team faced an unprecedented dilemma that pitted scientific intervention against natural process. Standard veterinary practice would dictate removing the deceased calf immediately to force Nala to focus on Django's survival. But Dr. Kariuki's cultural knowledge and Dr. Chen's growing understanding of elephant psychology suggested this approach could be catastrophic. Forced separation from her deceased calf might cause Nala to become violent, fall into irreversible depression, or reject Django entirely, even if presented with him, Dr. Rodriguez raised the medical reality that governed their decision-making timeline. They had perhaps 6 to 8 hours before Django's condition became irreversible, regardless of how they chose to handle Nala's psychological needs. The calf was entering the critical phase where starvation would begin causing permanent damage to his brain and other developing organs. They needed a solution that honored Nala's emotional requirements while saving her living calf's life. Through careful observation, they began to understand the complex social dynamics surrounding the crisis. The other elephants in the sanctuary weren't simply waiting for the situation to resolve. They were actively participating in something that resembled a community therapy session. Each female had a role in supporting Nala while working toward resolution of the crisis. Matisa, the elderly matriarch, seemed to be trying to communicate specific guidance to Nala through a combination of vocalizations and physical gestures. She would touch the deceased calf gently with her trunk, then move to Django and repeat the touching behavior. Finally, she would gently push Nala toward her living calf with increasingly insistent pressure from her massive head and trunk. When Nala resisted and returned to the deceased calf, Matisa would repeat the entire sequence with growing persistence. Other elephants were playing supporting roles in this natural counseling process. Casey, a middle-aged female who had lost her own calf the previous year, positioned herself near Django and made soft maternal vocalizations that seemed designed to keep him calm and responsive during the crisis. Her behavior suggested that elephants who had experienced loss themselves took on special roles in helping others process grief. Dr. Kariuki explained that this was likely natural elephant grief counseling, a community-based healing process that Western psychology was only beginning to understand and appreciate. In wild elephant herds, elder females regularly helped grieving mothers transition from mourning to renewed parental engagement. But the process operated on elephant emotional timelines rather than human urgency, requiring patience and trust that most conservation situations couldn't accommodate. The team developed an unprecedented approach that represented a new synthesis of Western science and traditional African knowledge. They would facilitate Nala's natural grieving process while creating careful opportunities for Django to survive the extended timeline that emotional healing required. Dr. Rodriguez prepared emergency formula feeding equipment as a backup plan, but Dr. Kariuki convinced the team to trust the elephant community's wisdom as the primary intervention strategy. Sarah Williams focused her audio equipment on documenting the complex vocalizations occurring among the elephant community. The sounds were revealing patterns that suggested sophisticated emotional communication. Different types of calls for comfort, encouragement, guidance, and gradually increasing insistence that Nala acknowledge her living calf's needs. The elephants were having conversations about grief healing and responsibility that human language could barely begin to approximate. They waited through the afternoon, documenting every interaction, every sound, every subtle shift in the complex elephant drama. Around 3 p.m., something began to change in the dynamic. Matisse's persistent guidance seemed to be having a cumulative effect on Nala's awareness. The grieving mother began responding to the elder female's gentle pushing, occasionally looking toward Django when nudged, though she quickly returned her attention to the deceased calf. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source that demonstrated the sophisticated social intelligence of elephant communities. Kessie, the young female who had been providing comfort care for Django, began making specific vocalizations that mother elephants typically use to call their calves for nursing. She was essentially telling Django to seek milk while simultaneously signaling to Nala that maternal behavior was required. Django, weak but still responsive to instinctual cues, perked up at these familiar sounds despite his deteriorating physical condition. He moved toward Kessie with renewed energy, and she gently guided him toward Nala's side, using her trunk to provide physical support for his unsteady steps. For the first time in over 15 hours, Nala seemed to notice her living calf's presence. Her trunk reached out tentatively, touching Django, as if rediscovering his existence after a long absence. The moment was brief but significant. Nala's trunk explored Django's small body for several seconds, checking his condition with the thorough attention of a concerned mother. But then she returned her focus to the deceased calf, leaving Django confused and still hungry beside her massive leg. The interaction represented progress, but not yet the breakthrough that would save the living calf's life. Dr. Chen realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in animal behavior research. A community of elephants working together to help a grieving mother reconnect with her living offspring while still honoring her psychological need to mourn her dead one. It was a delicate balance that required infinite patience and complete trust in elephant wisdom accumulated over millions of years of social evolution. As afternoon faded toward evening, the pattern became clearer and more hopeful. The elephant community was indeed creating a natural therapy session, allowing Nala to grieve while gradually reintroducing her to her maternal responsibilities. But the process was achingly slow, and time was running out for Django's survival. The tension between natural healing and biological necessity was reaching a critical point that would test everyone's faith in the elephant community's ability to resolve the crisis naturally. The question that haunted Dr. Chen as shadows lengthened across the savannah was whether there would be enough time for this remarkable natural process to save Django's life. As the sun set on the second day of this extraordinary drama, he prepared for another sleepless night, knowing that by dawn they would either witness one of nature's most remarkable healing processes or face the tragedy of losing both calves to the profound depths of maternal grief. The third dawn over Amboseli brought subtle but significant changes that gave the research team their first real hope since this extraordinary drama began. Dr. James Chen, surviving on coffee determination and the adrenaline of witnessing unprecedented animal behavior, noticed immediately that the elephant's protective circle had evolved overnight. Instead of the tight defensive formation of the previous 2 days, the females had created a more open arrangement that allowed for movement and interaction, while still providing complete security for the grieving family at the center. Nala remained close to her deceased calf, but the quality of her vigil had undergone a transformation that suggested internal psychological shifts invisible to human observation but apparently clear to her elephant companions. The frantic attempts to wake the body had ceased, entirely replaced by what could only be described as peaceful companionship. She would rest her trunk gently on the small form, making soft sounds that seemed more like lullabies than desperate calls for response. Dr. Michael Kariuki had spent much of the night in consultation with Maasai elders via satellite phone, gathering traditional knowledge about elephant mourning behaviors that had been passed down through generations of pastoralists who shared the landscape with these magnificent creatures. Their insights had proved invaluable throughout the crisis elephants needed to say goodbye in their own time and according to their own ancient protocols. Forcing the process could result in psychological trauma that might affect not only Nala but potentially disrupt the entire herd's social stability for years. Django, now 36 hours old and entering the most critical phase of his young life, was surviving on small amounts of milk he managed to steal during brief moments when Nala's attention wavered from her deceased calf. These nursing episodes were brief and incomplete, providing just enough nutrition to keep him alive, but far from the substantial feeding he needed for proper development. Dr. Elena Rodriguez had quietly positioned herself with emergency feeding equipment, ready to intervene instantly if the calf showed signs of complete physiological collapse. But Dr. Kariuki had convinced the team to continue trusting the elephant community's natural healing process, arguing that premature intervention could destroy the delicate psychological work being accomplished by the herd's collective wisdom. The elephants were demonstrating therapeutic techniques that human psychology was only beginning to understand. Community-based healing that addressed emotional trauma while maintaining social cohesion and ensuring survival of vulnerable community members. Sarah Williams had been monitoring the audio communications throughout the night and reported increasingly complex patterns of vocalization among the elephant females. The sounds weren't random expressions of concern, but appeared to follow sophisticated protocols for emotional support and behavioral guidance. Different elephants made specific types of calls that seemed designed to comfort, encourage, instruct, or gently pressure Nala toward acknowledging her living calf's needs. The breakthrough began with Matisa, the elderly matriarch whose 52 years of life experience included surviving drought poaching attempts, human encroachment, and the loss of her own offspring. At sunrise, she approached Nala with deliberate ceremonial steps that carried unmistakable ritualistic significance. What happened next would be seared into Dr. Chen's memory forever and would ultimately revolutionize scientific understanding of elephant emotional intelligence. Matisa began what could only be called a funeral speech, a series of low, complex vocalizations that seemed to carry meaning and emotion far beyond simple animal communication. The sounds had structure, rhythm, and emotional modulation that resembled human eulogy more than animal calls. She stood beside the deceased calf, her trunk gently touching its small body while directing these elaborate vocalizations toward Nala with clear, intentional communication. Other elephants joined this vocal ritual in a carefully orchestrated sequence. Each female approached in turn, added her voice to the growing chorus, and touched the deceased calf with her trunk in gestures that seemed both reverent and final. But this time, instead of leaving immediately after their individual contributions, they remained in position, creating a living cathedral of mourning around Nala and her dead baby. Dr. Chen watched through tears as this ancient ceremony unfolded, realizing he was witnessing something that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal consciousness and spiritual capacity. The elephants weren't simply responding to death with instinctual behaviors. They were conducting a sophisticated ritual that acknowledged loss, honored the brief life that had passed, and provided community support for the grieving mother in ways that seemed to transcend purely biological responses. The ceremony lasted nearly 2 hours, with each elephant contributing specific vocalizations and gestures that appeared to follow traditional patterns passed down through generations of elephant culture. The complexity and apparent intentionality of the ritual suggested that elephants possessed not only individual emotional depth, but also collective spiritual practices that helped their communities process loss and transition back to life-sustaining activities. When the formal ceremony concluded, Matisa did something that stunned the research team and marked the beginning of active healing intervention by the elephant community. She wrapped her massive trunk around the deceased calf's body and gently began moving it away from Nala toward a grove of fever trees approximately 200 meters away. Other females joined her in this solemn procession, creating a funeral parade that carried the small body toward what Dr. Kariuki recognized as a traditional elephant burial ground. Nala followed the procession, but her movement suggested profound internal conflict that marked the crucial transition point in her healing process. She would take several steps with the group carrying her deceased calf, then turn back toward Django, who was trailing behind on increasingly unsteady legs. For the first time in 3 days, she seemed torn between her dead calf and her living one, indicating that her absolute focus on grief was beginning to accommodate awareness of ongoing maternal responsibilities. At the Fever Tree Grove, the elephants arranged themselves in a final ceremonial circle around the deceased calf's body. Dr. Kariuki explained that this was likely a traditional elephant burial ground, a sacred place where the herd brought their dead for final rest according to customs that predated human civilization in the region. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything documented in scientific literature and would become the foundation for Dr. Chen's groundbreaking research on elephant funeral rites. Each elephant took turns covering the small body with carefully selected branches, leaves, and dirt. But this wasn't random or instinctual behavior. It was clearly ritualized with specific patterns and procedures that suggested cultural transmission of burial practices across generations. Matisa supervised the entire process, occasionally adjusting placements or guiding younger elephants in their contributions to the burial according to established protocols. Throughout this elaborate burial process, Nala participated fully, but kept looking back toward Django with increasing frequency and apparent concern. The calf had found a shaded spot under a nearby acacia tree and collapsed too weak to follow the procession any further. His breathing had become shallow. His eyes were beginning to close frequently, and his responses to stimuli were becoming sluggish. Dr. Rodriguez made subtle hand signals to Dr. Chen. They were reaching the absolute critical point where intervention would become necessary regardless of cultural sensitivity or respect for natural processes. But the elephant's collective wisdom proved superior to human anxiety and medical timelines. As the burial ceremony reached its formal conclusion, Matisa approached Nala and began a different type of vocalization entirely. These sounds were firmer, more insistent, and carried unmistakable authority. They were clearly directing Nala's attention toward something specific and non-negotiable, her responsibility to her living offspring. Kessie, the young female, who had been providing supportive care throughout the crisis, had quietly moved to stand directly beside Django's weakening form. She was making maternal calls while gently touching the exhausted calf with her trunk, providing both physical comfort and clear signals about what needed to happen. Her message was unmistakable to everyone present: your living baby needs you now, and his survival cannot wait any longer for your grief to resolve. What happened next would become the centerpiece of Dr. Chen's landmark paper on elephant emotional intelligence and the subject of documentaries that would reshape public understanding of animal consciousness. Nala approached her living calf as if seeing him clearly for the first time in 3 days of grief-induced blindness. Her trunk explored his small body with thorough maternal attention, checking his health, his temperature, his level of responsiveness, and his urgent need for nutrition. The examination was comprehensive and clearly distressing to Nala as she realized how much her living calf had suffered during her period of mourning. Her vocalizations became urgent and apologetic as she lowered her massive form to lie beside Django, carefully positioning herself so that he could access her milk easily. The transition from grief to active nurturing was so sudden and complete that it seemed to represent a fundamental shift in psychological state rather than gradual emotional recovery. Django, despite his weakness and the disorientation caused by days of neglect, responded immediately to his mother's invitation with the powerful survival instincts that had kept him alive through the crisis. He latched onto a teat and began nursing with desperate intensity, his small body trembling with the effort of consuming the nutrition he desperately needed. For several minutes the only sounds were his urgent suckling and Nala's contented rumbling, a sound elephants make when experiencing deep satisfaction, peace, and maternal fulfillment.